If you have PMDD and you've ever wondered whether you also have adrenal fatigue, that question actually makes sense. While adrenal fatigue isn't an official medical diagnosis, the stress system is absolutely part of the PMDD conversation, and HPA axis dysregulation shows up as one of the core biological pieces in the research. So in this video, I'm going to break down what's real about that connection, what's oversimplified, and why understanding the difference can completely change how you think about your PMDD. Hi, I'm Jess. I'm a clinical nutritionist, and over the years, I've worked with a lot of women who are trying to make sense of two things at the same time: cyclical mood symptoms and what feels like stress system burnout, which still gets referred to a lot as adrenal fatigue. While this overlap is 100% real and actually quite common, the way we interpret it matters. When people use the term adrenal fatigue, they're usually describing a cluster of symptoms they're experiencing, like fatigue, poor stress tolerance, or that wired but exhausted feeling. The reason the term adrenal fatigue isn't accepted in conventional endocrinology is because when researchers actually test adrenal gland function in these cases, the glands themselves typically function normally. We don't see structural damage or the inability to produce cortisol in the way the term sometimes implies. So the conversation shifted from, are the adrenals failing, to, is the stress response system dysregulated? And that's where this becomes super relevant to PMDD. In PMDD literature, HPA axis involvement is one of the main biological pathways that's been explored, which means the stress system is part of the picture, not necessarily as gland failure, but as differences in stress sensitivity, reactivity, and regulation. To understand this better, let's look at one of the primary players that's often mentioned in stress physiology: cortisol. One of the repeating themes in PMDD literature is not high cortisol and not necessarily low cortisol, but differences in how cortisol is regulated across the day. So we're going to look at some science for a minute, and don't worry if you don't really understand what it means. I'm going to make sense of it right after we go through it. In one ambulatory assessment study, women with PMDD showed a delayed cortisol awakening response peak and a flatter slope, which means that the normal morning surge was shifted and the drop from morning to night was less steep. So basically not cortisol output failure, but altered regulation. In a different lab study that used a standardized psychosocial stressor, the PMDD group showed a blunted cortisol response during the mid to late luteal phase. In other words, when exposed to acute stressors, their cortisol didn't rise as robustly as the controls. In a third study, researchers directly stimulated the stress system using a pharmacological challenge. In that setting, ACTH and cortisol responses were not significantly different between women with PMDD and controls. That means that when the stress system is directly pushed in that lab setting, the signaling from the brain and the adrenal glands did appear intact. However, when researchers looked at 24-hour urine-free cortisol, which reflects total daily cortisol output, it was lower in the PMDD group. So what does that mean? It means that under direct stimulation, the stress system works, but across daily life, the overall output and regulation may look different. When you take a step back and look at all of this together, the pattern isn't consistently high cortisol. It's not adrenal underproduction. It's differences in timing, reactivity, and flexibility. When flexibility decreases, stress doesn't necessarily get higher, it just gets harder to regulate. This is what I think of as a cortisol trap. Not a situation where cortisol is simply too high or too low, but where the system has lost some of its dynamic range. The rhythm may be altered, the response to stress may be blunted or mismatched, and recovery just doesn't feel smooth. So from the outside, it can look and feel like burnout. But physiologically, it's more of an ongoing regulation issue than a production failure. So if this isn't about adrenal gland failure, why does stress feel so much worse in the days before your period? To answer that, we need to look at what's happening in the luteal phase, and specifically something called neurosteroid withdrawal. After ovulation, progesterone rises. Progesterone gets converted in the brain into a neuroactive steroid called allopregnanolone. Allopregnanolone acts on GABA-A receptors, and GABA is one of your primary calming neurotransmitters. It's involved in emotional regulation, anxiety buffering, and stress resilience. Late in the luteal phase, usually the week or days before your period, progesterone and allopregnanolone drop sharply. When allopregnanolone drops, GABA buffering drops as well. And when that buffering drops, stress perception increases. If someone already has reduced stress system flexibility, the loss of luteal buffering can amplify the experience dramatically. So it's not that cortisol is suddenly spiking out of control, it's that the brain has less capacity to buffer stress during that window. So the combination of altered HPA axis regulation plus that neurosteroid withdrawal is often what's driving that physiological feeling of adrenal fatigue, burnout, and PMDD mood symptoms. Now, the research on neurosteroid withdrawal is the strongest in the late luteal phase. That's where we see the sharpest drop. I mention this because I know many women report feeling dysregulated throughout the entire luteal phase, not just that last week or the last few days. That probably involves multiple mechanisms: progesterone's effect on HPA tone as it rises and falls, could be psychological anticipation, a cumulative stress load across the cycle. We don't have all the answers yet, but the late luteal mechanism, that neurosteroid withdrawal piece, is the clearest part of the puzzle we have right now. Okay, so now that we understand the science, why does it matter whether we call this adrenal fatigue, HPA axis dysfunction, or even understand the complexity of what's going on? This matters because the labels we use, even in our own minds, shapes the solutions we chase. If you think that you have adrenal fatigue, the mental model becomes, my adrenals are damaged and I need to repair them. I'm going to share a secret with you. After working in functional medicine for a decade, I can tell you what this mindset leads to is chasing the right supplement stack, maybe short-term interventions like quitting caffeine or taking a sabbatical from work, often with the expectation that there is a time frame where your adrenals can be healed. When what someone may really need in this situation is to work on building regulation and resilience over time. How can we manage a regulatory system that needs ongoing support? In my opinion, a simple shift from repair to regulation can change everything about how you approach PMDD or even adrenal fatigue, HPA axis dysfunction from a more holistic lens. That being said, if you want to know more about the system that I developed to help support PMDD, then check out this video right up here. And hopefully I'll see you in that one.